Stuka Joe here. Today we will be playing one of the scenarios of this game, A Splendid Little War. This is a game designed by Andy Nunez and published by Legion Wargames. And this is a game about the Santiago campaign during the Spanish-American War of 1898. The map shows Santiago de Cuba and its surrounding areas. Now the campaign game lasts 28 turns. We will be playing the July 1st scenario, which has battles occurring in two particular areas of the map. One of those areas is the areas around the village of El Caney, and we see two posts. Those are used to denote victory hexes that the Americans have to occupy in order to win the game, and they have only 3 turns to do so. One is the village of El Caney, and the other one is the fort of El Viso, and we have a Spanish company of the Constitucion battalion starting there at Fort El Viso. The Spanish have actually 3 companies of that battalion, one also in an entrenchment near the fort, and another one in an entrenchment to the south of El Caney. In addition, the Spanish have guerrillas that have a question mark for a combat rating because their reliability is uncertain, and we have to roll to see what their combat strength is whenever they engage in combat. So those are the Spanish units defending El Caney and Fort El Viso. Here are the American forces near El Caney and Fort El Viso. There are elements of 2 divisions. The 2nd division with a light blue background, and you see a green band. It's a total of 6 regiments, and they're commanded by General Lawton. In addition, attached to this division, General Lawton has an artillery battery and a cavalry troop. Also, there are volunteer units with General Duffield nearby. So these units will be tasked with taking El Caney and Fort Viso early on. And a special rule in this game is that these are the only units that can move and participate in combat in the first turn. The remaining units on the map, which we will show now, cannot move or engage in combat in the first turn. Now, the other area where we will see combat is the area around San Juan Hill. And in this particular area, there are 6 objective hexes. The Americans have a considerable number of regiments near in that area, but as you can see, they are pretty constrained in terms of spacing. There are units of the 1st Division under General Kent, and that's a total of 10 regiments. And then there are 6 regiments from the Cavalry Division under General Joe Wheeler. And these units have really turns 2 and 3 to break through the Spanish defenses that you see there and occupy those objective hexes, and also the objectives shown near El Caney, while sustaining 9 or less steps in losses in order to win. Here we see the reinforcements that will enter the game. In turn 1, the Americans receive a Gatling gun unit. The Spanish receive a leader and a company of sailors, and also 2 guerrilla units. We've seen the victory conditions. Let's take a look at the sequence of play. The game has a sequence of play in the rule book. I made a deck of sequence of play cards that tracks exactly what's in the rule book. So the first phase is the weather phase, but this only applies beginning on turn 7, and our scenario comprises turns 1 to 3. So we will skip this phase, but if we would be playing the campaign game, we would be rolling to determine whether there's good weather or bad weather, and bad weather has a lot of nasty consequences, including the onset of the yellow fever. But this particular phase will be skipped in our 3-turn scenario. Next would be the U.S. supply phase, where we determine the supply status of U.S. units. In this game, all American units have to trace supply to this hex that we've marked here. This is hex 0937. It is a road hex that leads off to the eastern edge of the map. And to be in supply, an American unit can trace a line of up to 7 hexes to a road or trail that leads to that hex, or to a leader that in turn can trace a line of up to 7 hexes to such road or trail. And we can see from the beginning of the scenario that all these units that are near San Juan Hill can all trace supply to that particular hex, as well as the units that are further to the north in the vicinity of El Caney. There are trails that units can use to trace supply. So all American units begin the game in supply. The next phase is the U.S. command phase, where we check to determine if there are any U.S. units that are not within command range of their leaders. In this game, the formations that you see are color-coded, like, for example, the cavalry division, and their leaders are shown here. You have two, actually. You have Roosevelt, and you have also Wheeler. And the second number in their counter is the number of hexes that they can trace a path to determine whether their units are in command. So, for example, Wheeler can place units in command if those units are within 4 hexes of his counter. And the same goes for General Kent for the 1st Division. There are some really dire effects if units are out of command, like, for example, units that are out of command can only move 1 hex during a turn. Now, during the first turn, all units are deemed to be in command, and that is important because the Americans have units from their 2nd Division which are not within command range of their commander here, General Lawton, which is to the south here of El Caney. So those units in the first turn, it is very probable they will be marching towards El Caney to join forces with their other brothers of the 2nd Division. And you can see that the 2nd Division is spaced between these units here near bivouac area number 1, and units here near bivouac area number 2, which is right here. So the Americans have to take care of that situation before turn 2, so that all these units from the 2nd Division are in command. Next phase is the U.S. reinforcement / withdrawal phase, and that's where the U.S. would receive that Gatling gun unit. The next phase is the U.S. movement phase, where the U.S. player moves his units, and then we would have the U.S. combat phase. And combat in this game is slightly different from other games. In this game, there's 2 types of combat. Fire combat, which can be performed at a range of 1 or up to 2 hexes away from the defending unit, and assault combat, which is considered to occur in the same hex as the defending unit. And the sequence is as follows. The U.S. player designates which units will assault, and the U.S. player would signify this by placing this marker, assault combat, on his units that will be assaulting adjacent enemy units. Then the Spanish player resolves defensive fire with his units in range. These can be units that are adjacent to the assaulting units or within 2 hexes, and those units within 2 hexes fire at half firepower. And then after the Spanish player conducts defensive fire, the U.S. player conducts offensive fire with units that are in range but are not designated for assault combat. And then the U.S. player conducts the assault, and assault is the only form of combat that can actually gain the ground that you are attacking. So after the U.S. combat phase, we have the U.S. out of supply morale check phase. Units that are out of supply at this point during the turn then have to conduct morale checks. And if they fail those morale checks, those units are considered broken. Broken units have a series of penalties, and we mark those units with these markers here. Among those, the units do not have a zone of control. Next comes now the Spanish turn, and we would start with the Spanish supply phase. And Spanish units trace supply to Santiago de Cuba, and it's the same as with the Americans. 7 hexes to a road that leads to Santiago, or to a leader that in turn can trace a line of up to 7 hexes to Santiago. And we can see that the Spanish units in the vicinity here of San Juan Hill are all in supply at this time, and the same situation occurs with the Spanish units near El Caney. There's a couple of roads that lead west to Santiago. The next phase is the Spanish command phase, and here the Spanish player, as the American did before, checks to determine if his units are in command. In this game, the Spanish command structure is not as rigid as that of the Americans. The American units have to trace command to their respective leaders. For example, units of the cavalry division have to trace command either to General Wheeler or Roosevelt here. They cannot trace command to Kent because Kent commands a different formation, the 1st Division. That is not so with the Spanish. Spanish non-naval units, which are most in the game, can trace command to any leader. There are a few exceptions. One is Colonel Escario, which you see there with the dark brown background. He can command units that share that same colored background. So those units have to trace command to him, but we won't see his forces in this scenario. And Lieutenant Colonel Melgar can only command artillery units. And the other exception is here, Captain Bustamante can only command Spanish sailor units like the one you see here. As with the American command phase in the first turn of the game, we do not conduct a command check. The next phase is the Spanish reinforcement withdrawal phase. And then comes the Spanish movement phase, followed by the Spanish combat phase, where we conduct combat in the same way as we stated before, but in an inverse order. The Spanish player designates units that will assault. The U.S. player conducts defensive fire, followed by the Spanish player conducting offensive fire with those units in range that won't assault. And then finally, we resolve the assault. And the next phase is the Spanish out of supply morale check phase. And finally, the last phase of the game is the end phase, and here various things happen. We perform recovery die roll checks for broken units, so this is like a rally attempt to see if those broken units get back to normal. We roll for a possible Spanish surrender. The U.S. player checks to see if his observation balloon is eliminated, and if this is not the last turn of the game, we go to the next turn. This particular scenario, at first glance, you may believe it's a walkover for the U.S., but when you take a closer look, it appears that the terrain is a much formidable opponent than even the Spanish defenders. The Spanish don't have a lot of companies to stop the Americans. They have 3 entrenched companies in this area here, in Kettle Hill and here. And the problem for the Americans is really the terrain. Many of their units are in this type of terrain, which is jungle terrain, and that costs 2 movement points per hex. In addition to jungle, there's a swamp terrain nearby, and swamp terrain is 4 movement points per hex. Crossing a river without a bridge is 2 movement points. Now, luckily in this game, there is a 1 hex minimum move rule. So units will be able to move 1 hex. However, it doesn't seem to me that the Americans will be able to gather a large force to surround these positions during that second turn, which is the turn when they can move their units. As stated before, these units cannot move or attack in the first turn. So during this upcoming first turn, what we will see actually is action near El Caney. These units can and will move and attack during the first turn. So stay tuned for the next episode of A Splendid Little War, where we will have the first turn of the game with action around El Caney. This is Stuka Joe signing off for now. Thanks for watching.